joining me. I was laughing when you called it by the nickname that I call this presentation, which is how to make the sausage. It's not the official name. That's the sort of nickname of this presentation, but it really is that. Policy making, like sausage making, is very messy. There are many different parts that go into it. And you really never know what's going to come out on the other end. So I'm glad you called it that, but in all seriousness, this lecture is really about shaping U.S. policy from different perspectives, from the executive branch, from Congress, and from the non-governmental perspective. And I have had experience in those three sectors, so I'm speaking from experience. And as Jay mentioned, I do teach a class, graduate level class at GW, the Elliott School. It's over 6 weeks long, so I'm going to try and compact all that into a very cursory overview of these three things: the executive branch, Congress, and NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and how they impact policy. In the class, I focus, and in this presentation, I focus mostly on foreign policy. But I think this could be applicable to all types of policymaking, including domestic, obviously. So what I wanted to do, just for those that are here, is on the top of your little bar here, you'll see a little man with his hand raised like that. I wanted to take a very quick poll. So if you can locate that thing, the first question I'll ask is, how many of you have had experience in Congress? If you can just use that little man to sort of vote, or the red cross sign, that works as well. Okay, so we've got some have not had congressional experience, so it's kind of split. What about working in the non-governmental and non-congressional, so non-profits or think tanks, civil society groups? Who's had a background in that? Go ahead and vote. Okay. I see some votes coming in. Great. So, this will be, hopefully it'll just be a way to give you a better sense of what those sectors are like from my own experience again, and from having lived and worked in DC now for 13 years. So what I'd like to start off with is simply a brief, let me just see if this works here. There we go. A brief overview of policymaking. The two key things, the two most important points to remember about policymaking process: one is that it's very complex, it's very nuanced, and two, it is very political. And I would say, especially nowadays, and we can get into that in the Q&A if you all want. So, not many people realize that policymaking is very nuanced. It's made across various branches of government, but it's also got a lot of impact from non-governmental actors or civil society community, the media, and also the public, the American public. So the couple of different folks that, just to take into consideration, who is influencing policy? President of the United States, his presidential advisor, his or her presidential advisor, the cabinet members, high-level officials like the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, folks like that, the foreign policy bureaucracy, or just the policy bureaucracy in general, Congress, certainly, the courts, sometimes, local and state governments, the public, political parties, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party have their own party platforms on politics, on policy, interest groups, whether it's advocacy groups or lobbying groups, and we'll talk about the difference in a few minutes on that. The media, certainly, and sometimes even international actors and multilateral organizations like the International Atomic Energy Agency or the United Nations. You also, of course, have the business community who's inputting into policymaking, the military, certainly, and sometimes even other countries, and how that, you look into how those countries will look at our policy and perhaps have that shape how you actually make the policy. So it's obviously very complex, very nuanced, but policymaking is also very political. So what do we mean by politics? What are some definitions of politics? And I'll offer just a few, and certainly there are many, many more. But one definition is who gets what, when, and how. Another definition is Politics is a competition for power and shared meaning. A third definition, this is a little bit more complicated, so I'm going to go ahead and read it off my notes here. Politics is competition between different individuals and groups for control of government and the support of the public and influence throughout society in order to make that happen and to promote the certain ends that these groups want. And finally, politics defines the national interest, or what is best for this country, or at least it should. And this, of course, is very subjective. What one person thinks is the most important thing in the world, another person might not prioritize so much. So we can see that politics is very political, very nuanced, and also subjective, fortunately or unfortunately. Politics does also tend to reflect the goals and the priorities of the individuals and groups that are most successful in influencing the political process. And this is why I think this lecture is important, because you can kind of see what the process is like, how the groups are influencing the process at different angles. And the other thing that to keep in mind about policy making overall is that tensions exist everywhere. They exist within each of the sectors within the executive branch, within the State Department, within DoD, and between those sectors. So let me just give you a couple of examples. Within the executive branch, for example, there are different bureaus at the State Department. So the folks at the Libya desk may not necessarily agree with the folks working on nuclear weapons, but they all gotta work together and on one policy. Similarly, in the Pentagon, between the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the services, there are certainly tensions that exist and different perspectives, and rightfully so. When we look at Capitol Hill, there are different committees. There's the Armed Services Committee, and then there are also individual members as well that make up those committees, so there are tensions there. Certainly, when we've seen this a lot, especially between the State Department and the Department of Defense, there are tensions between the executive branch sectors. On the Hill, you can see this from the House of Representatives and the Senate, and then within the House, you have the committees and the caucuses and the members. And in terms of the nonprofit sector, the NGO sector, non-governmental organization sector, there are differences between various NGOs working on an issue. So you're working on human rights, but you're all competing for the same resources, and you all come at it from a different perspective. So there's a lot of tension built in there as well. And then finally, between the different players themselves, the executive branch, we're seeing a lot now, versus Capitol Hill versus the public. So this is all to show you that there's like sausage making, this is a very complex process. A lot can go wrong. There's a lot of tension everywhere, and sometimes perhaps it's good because it's built in and it creates those checks and balances that are necessary. But so the way I look at it almost is that the competition leads to both opportunities and certainly challenges of influencing policy. You just got to figure out where you can influence policy in a positive way, or where you can stop bad policy from moving forward. The only other thing I'll say about policymaking, the overview, and now we'll dig in a second into the various pieces, is about the media. And the media's influence on policymaking is huge. And that has changed over the past few years, as we all know. I mean, I think we all watched September 11th unfolding on CNN, whether we were involved or not. I think it's a perfect example of how the media has shaped policy. I would say because of the 24-hour news cycle and all of the issues being in the public eye, the media does play a significant role in policymaking. There's necessarily a need to quickly turn around on a news cycle, both in terms of the U.S. government response as well as NGO response. You always have to be ready to react to the news cycle. Unfortunately, that means a lot of us are on our BlackBerries all the time, sort of seeing what's happening. You're always under public scrutiny, and again, that's good and bad. I mean, sometimes you just want to hunker down and do your job, and sometimes there needs to be public scrutiny because someone's not doing their job right, or they're trying to undermine U.S. policy in a certain way. And then finally, I think this is a touchy one, so I'm not going to get into it, but I did want to make sure to address it, is that the media oftentimes gives a platform to minority viewpoints that just know how to use the media really well. So two examples come to mind for me. One is the Occupy Wall Street movement. and the other one is the Tea Party movement. And I won't say much about either of those right now, or really throughout this presentation. You can get into some dicey territory, but what I will say is that both the Tea Party movement and the Occupy Wall Street movement do not represent a majority of Americans, and yet for a certain time period that was all that was on the news. So that's just another example of how, if you know how to use the media, you can certainly influence policymaking. So let's start here with the executive branch, and please feel free if I'm, and we'll take questions at the end, but if there's something that, if I'm saying an acronym or something that you all don't recognize, please feel free to enter in the chat or raise your hand or something like that, and I'll make sure to stop and answer that question. So, so far so good. I don't see any questions in the chat. So let's dig into the executive branch. The thing to remember about the executive branch and its role in policymaking is that there are no foreign policy powers, and this is specific to foreign policy power, that are provided to the President of the United States that are also not provided to Congress. So there's your built-in check and balance in the Constitution. So the Constitution, as you can see here on the slide, the two pieces that really pertain to specifically to foreign policy making are Article 2, Section 2, and Section 3. Now let me just go over the roles of the President and how he influences and shapes foreign policy. First, the President is the chief diplomat. He's the one that goes to the very high level, senior level summits and meetings, etc. abroad, and meets with prime ministers and presidents of different countries. So it's his voice that is really being heard, and the relationships that he has with others. Second, the President appoints the Secretary of Defense, SecDef, Secretary of Defense, and other high-level ambassadors. Now, the balance that comes into that is that, as we saw with Susan Rice's nomination, for example, for Secretary of Defense, Congress can certainly have a voice, and they can veto the President's choices. Right now, actually, Senator Graham is blocking the Department of Energy Secretary Moniz over the mixed oxide fuel MOX facility in his state. He wants guarantees that there will be money for this in his state, and he's going to block the Department of Energy Secretary until he gets those guarantees. So that's a perfect real-life example right now. The President is also the Commander-in-Chief. We all know that. However, and I'm not going to get into this because it is a little bit nuanced, but we know that the War Powers Act requires the President to get approval from Congress before he commits troops abroad. Now, certainly, this is very gray, and we've obviously gone to wars without without congressional approval, but that is another check and balance built in. The fourth, I think here, the role of the President is the chief legislature. Much of legislation actually originates in the executive branch. Think, the budget, for example. Although this year, I think it's a little bit flipped around. Congress started deliberating over the budget before we actually had one. So that's a perfect example of how sometimes, that's sort of on the books, but in reality, things can be a little bit flipped over. And certainly, just because the President is the chief legislature, Congress has the right to veto. That's their biggest, that and the power of the purse are the biggest, I would argue, sort of congressional pushbacks on the executive branch. The President also, less tangible, certainly not in the Constitution, but I think important to know is that the President is the voice of the people. He or she is the only public officer elected by all the American people. So they have a national mandate with this in hand. And then finally, the President is a chief judicial officer, which means that he can obviously appoint judges like the Supreme Court and other federal judges, but also he has the power of pardoning people. Again, the Senate approval comes into this as well, and certainly they can block this. And they can filibuster, as we saw with Rand Paul's amazing filibuster the other month. And you need 60 senators to override a filibuster. So there's a lot of checks and balances built, and this is again just meant to show you and give you an overview of what those are. So the limits on, so I've talked about sort of the prerogative of the executive branch and specifically the President. there are certainly many limits on the president's power, and we talked a little bit about those when I was mentioning, how Congress is pushing back on the president. The other limits on executive power that I wanted to just note for you all was, I have about a dozen, or half a dozen here, time. The first one is time. Time in your day, time in your term. Obviously, the president has an 8-year maximum term limit. Some folks are only elected for 1 term, so that is certainly a big factor that's pushing on their ability to influence policy or make policy. The second is information. I would say either too much information or too little information about a topic. The third is the bureaucracy, generally. And state is a huge bureaucracy. DOD is even larger. Department of Energy is huge with all its labs, and so it's just it's gigantic to get something through that bureaucracy, and it takes a lot of time, which again is limited. State and local governments, they're legislating all the time, and the president would have to respond if it has to do with something that is federal. They would have to respond or should respond to the federal and local government. Political parties, again, we talked a little bit about the Democratic platform or the Republican platform, and that shapes and sometimes constrains the president and the executive branch in what they want to do or can do. And finally, interest groups. And again, we'll talk about those when we talk about non-governmental organizations, NGOs. And then the last sort of piece of this is sort of the X factor issues. And these include things that, you're limited by 8 years, your time. You know what the bureaucracy like. You know what the political party platform is. The X factor issues are ones that you just don't know how it's going to go one way or the other. So, for example, you've got the media. Sometimes they love you, sometimes they hate you. You've got the global historical context. 9/11 is a perfect example. There was no way anybody could have figured, that was going to happen and what that would mean strategically for policymaking. The economy the past few years and the worldwide economic recession. Things like that. Public opinion is another one, a next factor. You can go up in public opinion and then you do something and the public reacts, with the media's help or not help in some cases. So those are just some things to keep in mind as challenges to the executive branch. So let me go to the next slide here. I just wanted to lay them out very clearly for you all. I won't really stay on this slide very much. I think just so you have it, if you want to download these slides, I think that's available to you. This just sort of outlines what I've just said in summary form. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward because I want to make sure we have time in the end for some questions. So we'll talk a little bit about Congress. Congress, as I mentioned, there is no foreign policymaking powers that are given to the president that are not also shared with Congress. And in addition to that, Congress's own powers are outlined in the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, and then Article 2, Section 10. But mostly it's Article 1, Section 8. As you can see, the other one is really about the state versus federal piece. So let's go here to the Congress's powers. And I spent 3 years working for a member of Congress, so this is part anecdote, part research from my class that I teach. And I'm certainly happy to answer any questions, on the record about what it was like working in the Congress. This was granted 10 plus years ago, so it's a little bit different then than it is now, unfortunately. So Congress, why is Congress powerful? What are Congress's powers to influence policymaking? First, there are 535 policymakers versus 1 president. Also in the Congress, you've got your committees, you've got your caucuses, you've got the leadership, minority, majority leadership. So there are a lot of folks up there influencing policy. For second, they're not bound, members of Congress, senators are not bound by international diplomacy, red lines and things like that. They can assemble a congressional delegation, a CODEL, and go to Burma, like Senator Jim Webb did years ago, and get involved in issues that are just too taboo, or Cuba, for example. Congresswoman Ileana Ross-Layton in is very involved in the Cuba issue. She's a member of Congress from Florida. Where the president cannot travel to Cuba, cannot have those types of meetings without a lot of red tape, a lot of pomp and circumstance. That just doesn't hold back members of Congress. Again, for good or bad, you be the judge of that. But that's another thing that members of Congress can do, and it's in their power to do, and use the president has a bully pulpit, and yes, has a national mandate. But members of Congress also have, the Senate floor, the House floor, where they can go out and speak about whatever issue they're passionate about or care about, and really have their voices heard across the world, really. The third power that I would say is, I call it the flexibility of the nitty-gritty. A lot of Americans, and I would say, I don't know if most, but maybe most Americans, I don't know what the poll number is. So that is the great thing about being a member of Congress, is that whatever you care about, you can care about Armenia, and your constituents may not really care about Armenia policy, but if it's something that really jazzes you up, then you can run with it. And as long as you're providing good jobs back home, and you're helping take the voices of your constituents on issues they do care about, it's not really going to matter what you do on foreign policy. You can go with it, you can run with it, like Congressman Jim Webb and Burma. So that's the sort of third power, the flexibility of the nitty-gritty. The fourth, I mentioned this before when we were talking about presidential powers, is money, the power of the purse. The president can't do what isn't funded, and so he needs to engage with Congress on his policy priorities, because you need to get money appropriated for these things. The fifth U.S. Congress power is that, and I would say that this is true also of the executive branch, is that there are a lot of support agencies, and this is in contrast to the NGO community, where there aren't that many. You kind of rely on yourself. There are a lot of support agencies that help with policy ideas. So as a lowly staffer, when I worked in Congress, I had sort of half-baked ideas, and then I would go and talk with experts at the Congressional Research Service and say, hey, my boss really wants to do this. Here's what I was thinking. Does that exist? What are the nuances of that? How do I do that? What are the specific pieces? And you have experts in the various support agencies that can help you, that are nonpartisan, that are really there just to be objective issue experts. And so you've got the Government Accountability Office, you've got the Congressional Research Service I just mentioned, the Congressional Budget Office, and so many more, the Library of Congress, so many more. So that's really, really helpful for those that are pressed for time and don't have the issue expertise. Then the final one, and actually again a big one, is the oversight. So the president is always called, or the president, obviously his advisors, are called to the Hill to testify at hearings, congressional hearings, about various policy, the progress on different policies, and what's going on, what went wrong. A perfect example right now is the Benghazi hearings that have been going on for a while. But that's the job of the Congress, is to provide that oversight and make sure that the president is carrying out the policies that are laid forward, and that he's doing that in a way that's that's true to our national security and our needs as a country. They also, just as a side note, the Congress can attach conditions to things like foreign aid, for example, so that there is an oversight loop automatically built in. They'll pass a piece of legislation within which will be, in 6 months you need to provide a report and come testify to us, or they can just subpoena you and call you up to the Hill if need be. So those are really the powers of Congress. Now let's talk a little bit about Congress's limits, and what are some things that keep them in check. So just like the president, members of Congress have to worry about elections. House members, House of Representatives, are elected every 2 years. Senators are elected every 6. But believe me, 2 years is not a long time between elections, and you're really always fundraising and making sure that you're keeping your constituents happy, those that provide you money in your district, and just making sure that you're in line with the party, with various priorities. And so you're always running for office. Senators, you get a little bit of a break, but still 6 years is not a long time between elections. And so that is always in the back or the forefront of your mind. The second limit to Congress is that even though there are members of Congress that come to the Hill with very specific and deep knowledge, you're a nuclear engineer or you're an elementary school teacher or what have you, you can't know everything about everything, and you're asked to vote on a lot of different issues across a lot of issue areas that you may not be familiar with. So the lack of deep issue knowledge for members of Congress, MOC, is something that is a limit on their ability to influence policymaking. And I would say, they'll still influence policymaking, but influence it in a way that is effective and that is smart, actually. So one thing that this leads to a lot of the time is that you'll fall back to relying on more senior members of Congress who have been there for a while, who sort of know the issues, and you'll just say, well, what do you think, Senator Kerry? What do you think, Senator Kyle? And then you'll really rely on those members to guide your choices. So, and then just the last thing, in terms of the deep issue knowledge, sometimes you'll just simply rely on the political party platform. What does the Democratic Party say about this issue? What does the Republican Party say about this issue? And in my opinion, again, that's not necessarily a good thing. You should have the time in the day to make your own informed decisions, but unfortunately, the way things are, you just don't. The third congressional limit is that the staff are really stretched very thin. As a staffer, when I was on the Hill, I covered about 10 issues, from defense, national security, budget, to trade, to energy, to animal rights, because I was the youngest one there, so I covered animal rights. It kind of got lumped in with everything else. But the point is that your staff are very stretched thin. Even on the Senate side, you'll have a staff person who's in charge of veterans and defense issues. But as we all know, veterans and defense issues are very nuanced. There are a lot of sub-issues within defense. So even they're very, very, very stretched thin, even on the Senate side. You've also got a lot of staff turnover, and so every new staff person needs to learn anew. And then finally, you're just, again, the time of the day, you're stretched thin, and you can't always make the most informed decisions, unfortunately. A fourth limit is that to get things done, you really need to build coalitions and to collaborate with other members of Congress. And of course, what this means is that you dilute your own policy intentions and what you want to do, because you're horse trading. You're trying to get more people to support your piece of legislation, but you've got to change this sentence over here and change that sentence over there. So that's one thing that happens all the time, and it's a challenge, but it's just the way of the game. And then finally, only a small percentage of the thousands of bills that are introduced in every Congress actually become legislation. And so again, because the coalitions are formed, because bills fall apart after so much horse trading here and there, a lot of things can change, and so not everything, well, not most things pass. Even, for example, the budget. There's always a continuing resolution, except for the Department of Defense, which does get plussed up most years. So that's just, again, the way of the game. There's a huge complexity to the legislative process where, again, this goes back to one of the first slides, is you have a lot of opportunities, but a lot of challenges where you can insert influence and where there are some choke points that are built into the process. Then finally, the one last thing I'll say is that policymaking is done out in the open. Everything nowadays is on C-SPAN, is on, you can look at your member of Congress's vote, how he or she voted on a piece of legislation, almost instantaneously as they vote for it. The votes are published. The floor speeches are always televised on C-SPAN. There are reporters in the rooms during the hearings, the testimony, and so you're always being looked at, and there's a lot of pressure on members of Congress to respond to their constituents who are watching them at all times, and reporters who are trying to get stories out of them. And so that's the other challenge, and I guess I would say that that's also true of the executive branch. I think a little bit less so, because all your meetings aren't, thankfully, are not televised. But that's certainly something that members of Congress need to deal with all of the time. So this, again, is just a summary slide for you all about what I've talked about and sort of the similarities and differences between the executive branch and Congress and their ability to influence policymaking. There's nothing here that I haven't talked about, so I'll just go ahead and get to the next slide, which is the non-governmental organizations. I spent the last 7 years of my career working on foreign policy issues in the nonprofit world, leading up to foundations and different projects in these foundations. And so this is kind of closest to my heart because it was the last thing I've been involved with. And again, happy to take any questions on any of this. So just briefly, just like the Constitution regulates the executive branch and Congress, and certainly the courts. We haven't talked about the courts, but I think we'll park that for another lecture. The IRS guidelines specifically dictate what NGOs, non-governmental organizations, can and cannot do. We're not going to spend too much time on the IRS guidelines, even though it's kind of the sexy topic of the day with everything that we've been reading in the papers of late about the IRS and how they were allegedly cracking down more on more conservative non-governmental organizations. I do want to just leave you with a few sort of tidbits on the on lobbying and what isn't lobbying. So indulge me for a few minutes on that, and then we'll talk about more generally about what other opportunities there are in terms of NGO influence on policymaking. So what I will say about the key things to remember in terms of the lobbying. Lobbying by nonprofits is totally legal, 100% legal. There are guidelines and limits on what type of lobbying nonprofits do and how much they can do it, depending on your designation in the IRS. So perhaps you'll hear folks saying 501c4 and 501c3. Those are the IRS guidelines that guide nonprofits. And so if you're a 501c4 organization, you have no limits on lobbying. If you're a 501c3 organization, there are limits on lobbying. And there are various reasons. Again, I'm not going to get into them unless you want me to in the Q&A. But there are various reasons for these two designations and what they mean. So I'll just give you one example. For 501c4 organizations that are allowed to do as much lobbying as they want, they need to declare their donors. And 501c3 organizations do not, for example. So that's the first point, is that lobbying is, for nonprofits, is totally legal. The second point is just getting a little bit of a grasp on what is lobbying and what is not lobbying. And I'll just say that there's the IRS certainly lays out rules and guidelines, but it's a huge gray area. And each organization has their tons of lawyers that will tell them one thing, and a different organization will say another thing is okay, and another one will say, no, that's not okay, but this is. So it's a huge area, and a lot of organizations dance, close to the line of what you can and cannot do. So what is lobbying from the IRS perspective? Lobbying is specifically a communication. So there are three pieces, and they're underlined here specifically because of that. It's a communication to legislators, or urging the public to contact legislators intended to influence specific legislation. That's what lobbying is. And what is not lobbying is a little bit more nuanced. Things that are not lobbying are things like public education. Just informing the public if you combine yellow and red, that makes orange. You're not saying orange is the best color or it's the worst color. You're just giving them the facts. That's a bad example, but you get the point. Issue advocacy is also not lobbying. So when you're just simply talking about specific issues, as long as there is no specific piece of legislation or specific legislative decision that is coming up, and you're addressing a problem generally, non-proliferation generally versus the non-Lugar bill, then that's not lobbying, and that's okay, and you can do as much of that as you want. Other things that are not lobbying, nonpartisan analysis, which certainly don't need to be neutral or objective, but as long as you present the facts fully and fairly, and this this analysis is widely available, and it's not targeted to a specific Republicans or Democrats or a specific senator, then that's not lobbying. And as long as it doesn't have a direct call to action, vote on HR 1234. Then that is not lobbying. That's allowed. Responses to written requests is if a member of Congress writes you specifically or organization specifically and requests information or technical assistance, then that's not lobbying. A discussion with government officials about legislation and how that legislation will impact your NGO, your organization, its existence, its powers, its duties, that is not lobbying. And finally, just again, a discussion of broad policy matters with the general public, open to all the public, and you're not, specifically targeting a group, and with officials, even if the legislation is pending, that's not lobbying because it's available to all and it's a general discussion about that legislation. So, just like the Constitution legally regulates what Congress and the executive branch can and cannot do, the IRS laws do the same for NGOs. Informally, though, I just wanted to say that other NGOs, there are other ways to regulate NGOs, informal ways. So other NGOs will regulate their fellow NGOs. There's a lot of competition in the nonprofit world. And so you can rely on, for example, the Heritage Foundation to check the Center for American Progress, who then checks the American Enterprise Institute. So it's kind of, you're all sort of checking one another. The media similarly checks NGOs, and again, because that's their jobs, just make sure that they unearth any dubious practices. So that's another informal way that the NGOs are checked on policymaking. The last thing I'll say is that interest groups definitely influence policymaking in the political environment in a variety of different ways. So NGOs lobby policymakers directly or indirectly. That's the first thing. So they provide information to policymakers on their viewpoints most of the time. Most of the time it's not independent. And they also provide money. They can create political space by talking with other members of Congress or other constituents, just sort of giving them the room to make the right decision according to them. Or they can make it, you can name and shame. You can do the negative thing. If a member of Congress takes a vote that you don't like, you sort of rally up the grassroots and sort of point the finger at that member of Congress. NGO leaders are also another way that they influence policymaking is that they're often consulted by policymakers. You talk in DC, everyone knows the sort of famous revolving door between the think tanks in town and the USG and the government. And so leaders are consulted, foreign policy, NGO leaders, nonprofit leaders are often consulted by members of Congress and also executive branch policymakers. And then, finally, I talked about the revolving door, and was kind of joking about it, but in all seriousness, I mean, it kind of makes sense. When you don't agree with those that are in power, you tend to come out and you're still thinking the big policy ideas and hoping that, one day your party will be back in power and then you can go in and really make the policy in government. So, those are just a few of the different guidelines around NGOs and the way in which they have challenges and opportunities in influencing policymaking. And again, just like with the other ones, I wanted to just make sure to lay them out pretty clearly on this slide here. The other things that are not on this slide, so let me just go through actually because I don't know if I talked very much about the opportunities. NGOs, very bureaucratically nimble. The last place I worked, there were only 7 of us, and we got a lot done because there wasn't a lot of red tape. They're very free to say what they want. They're for good or bad, sometimes unfiltered, but they have no. I mean, the check you have is your funders and your board of directors, but you're not representing a constituency, you're not representing a district or a state, so you're a little bit more free. I'm just going to skip a few of these. You can certainly raise money, a lot of money for different things and get people jazzed up about something in your organization and raise money and influence them. You can directly mobilize constituents. You can go out and do some grassroots lobbying where certainly members of Congress, I think members of Congress can do that. I mean, they just don't have the time in the day to do it, and certainly the executive branch, there are a lot of rules against that. And then finally, there are innovative ways that you can use influence. So through the media, we talked about social media, but also celebrities. I mean, you see new celebrities tacked on to various issues all the time. So and that draws the media attention. That draws members of Congress. Oh yeah, I'll go to lunch with Matt Damon or Sandra Bullock on whatever, what have you, versus just some NGO wants you to go to lunch. Well, that's a little less exciting. So those are some of the opportunities. Other opportunities, I mentioned name and shame tactics. There's a very interesting sort of strange bedfellows case nowadays between some Tea Party folks and the small government folks and folks that want to cut the budget, the defense budget, specifically if you talk about like the liberal nonprofits. And so it's interesting to see that these, the strange bedfellows, you don't agree on a lot of things, but this thing you agree on, and you can work together tactically to get some things happen, and that's interesting. Whereas, if you were a Democrat, especially nowadays, unfortunately, as a member of Congress, it's a little tougher to sort of reach across the aisle, specifically on tactical things. And then finally, the NGOs have a lot of pressure points. They can pressure Congress. They can, different caucuses, different members of Congress. They can work through the media. They can work with the executive branch, et cetera. So some challenges just to highlight, and we'll finish up after this, and I'll close and just take questions. Some challenges. Organizational capacity varies very, very much. You're always fundraising as a nonprofit, and that's tough. It takes a lot of time to do that, and so there's this I mentioned a little bit. There's definitely disproportionate influence with some nonprofits that just know how to use the media really well, or have somehow snagged a really amazing celebrity, and then they're getting attention where they don't really represent a majority or even a large portion of the American public, but that's influencing policy because they can sort of yell the loudest and they know how to do that well. Let's see here. The last thing is simply that there's a lot of competition in the nonprofit world. Just by the name nonprofit, you're always sort of fighting and clawing for resources, and so that competition, unfortunately, when you do need to work together in coalition, is really tough. So that I will, I'll leave it there, I think, because I know there are some questions, and I'll just go ahead and stop. And there are just one last thing I wanted to point out to folks on this. I included a slide here. If y'all want to read more about certain pieces of this, these are just a few readings that I give to my class. And so you can have that at your own leisure. You can read more about the policymaking process. So I'll go back here and stop.
Great, thank you very much. We do have some questions already, and I encourage all of our attendees to go ahead and type your questions in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. If you think of one after we're done, we can email them and I can get them to our guest. Let me go ahead and kick off with one here by Mr. Prinsloo. He says, foreign policy making, does this not include the actions of the Department of State, or do you see the state as an executing arm of the president, as opposed to being a policy?
No, I would say that the State Department absolutely does include, it is one of the primary, if not the primary, or should be the primary player for foreign policy making specifically. And I didn't use specific examples because I didn't want to get into the nitty gritty, but no, certainly I would say they are one of the primary policy makers. And I mean, that's their job, right? Their job is exactly that, is to liaise with different countries, hear sort of what they're bringing back from the embassies. I mean, I interned at an embassy, our U.S. Embassy Stockholm in Sweden one summer between grad school years, and oh man, there were a lot of cables from Maine State to the embassies, from the embassies to Maine State, from the embassies to the embassies, and it was all a big part of the policy-making picture. Just getting that information, okay, digesting that information, what does that mean for our foreign policy? Absolutely, the State Department is at the crux, I would say, of our foreign policy-making.
Okay, let me get back to, you mentioned something on one of your slides about Congress. It sounds, the phrase that I remember was flexibility of nitty-gritty. It sounds like congressmen have this free reign. What did you see as most effective in either limiting them or enabling them?
That's a really good question. So what limited them? Well, I mean, what limited them is this is going to sound bad, but I'll say it anyway. I'm a New Yorker. I'm kind of open. It's when people were paying attention. That was limiting. It's, shoot, someone, my constituents are looking at what I'm doing on X issue. When they're not paying attention, it's a lot easier to sort of, and I think this goes a lot for, life in general, to do your job. You're just kind of doing your job. You're doing what you want to do, what you think is best, what you know is best for a certain policy. So when folks were paying attention, that's what made it difficult. I should say this: difficult if obviously if they didn't agree with what you were doing, or vice versa. If they were supportive, then certainly that was great. When people, I would always try and get attention to. There was a bill I worked on providing money for landmine removal, because you hear all these horror stories about kids all over the world getting blown up by landmines that not we necessarily, but that are scattered all over the place. And so, just trying to get some attention to that was just like pulling a leg. It's unbelievable. So I think that was sort of the liberating, and it's funny because all of these things, I'm not trying to be wishy-washy, but I think all of these things are nuanced. And the most helpful thing, if you can get a reporter or a media person to sort of pick up your thing, and then, oh my gosh, you see it on Time Magazine or in the New Yorker or in the Washington Times, and people are, wow, they're reading about it. Wall Street Journal just published an op-ed on my issue. That was really very, very helpful. But you just, the time in the day to make those connections, make those relationships, to get the reporter excited and jazzed up about some issue that they'll probably never encounter in their day-to-day life, that's really hard. So anyway, those are just a couple of initial thoughts. I'll think about it more if you want to provide me your email, and I'm happy to send you more thoughts.
And that kind of dovetails with another question we have. It says, and it kind of sounds like you partially answered it. Do you think it would be better to have more actions take place in the smoke-filled back rooms of yesteryear, perhaps to allow the members to discuss and to make the sausage without the constant oversight, and allow them a little more freedom?
You assume that's not happening. Believe me, there are plenty of senators I have seen in, not smoke-filled because you can't smoke anymore inside, but certainly the back rooms of restaurants, and there's sort of, there's this famous coffee shop right across from the White House where, oh man, you go there at 3 p.m. and it's filled, you just sit there, and it's filled with, with staffers from the White House who just sort of want a break from checking in their, their guests. And I'm sure this is not just now, this happened, this is sort of the famous, coffee places happened throughout administrations, that you just want a break, you want to just talk amongst friends, let's just, without having to sign you in, without having to, to make a big speech on the floor in the Senate. That happens a lot still. Do I think it's, look, I think there's only so much you can do, because there's only so much you should be doing in the sort of back rooms, because in the end, you're meant to be representing the people, and there should be some off-the-record conversations that you have to sort of gin up support here and there, and but I think in the end, it's good to have the oversight, it's good to have the clarity, it's good to have the media shining a spotlight, it's good to have the NGOs always sort of pointing a finger. It's kind of, it's what makes this country beautiful. It's what makes, as cheesy as that sounds, it's what makes democracy work, I think. And if you talk to people, even in, in England or in Germany, and sort of, modern societies, and I have colleagues across the world. They're just amazed that someone could come in and talk with their member of Congress and say, look, this is something that's important to me, and I want you to do something about it. And that's a beautiful thing. So I think, I think you have to have a balance between those two things.
Okay, great. I'd like to have go on to something else that you brought up about the media representation of minority views. You mentioned the Tea Party. You mentioned the Occupy Wall Street. It sounds like those are good supports for First Amendment rights, especially in this big information world. Do you think that has gone to excess, or do you think that portrayal of the minority views is grotesquely out of balance?
Yeah, uh, I, I mean, they're blips, right? So I think as long as, um, as long as that doesn't remain sort of in the news and that is what shapes policy completely, then I think it's okay. And there, it's kind of good to sort of shake things up a little bit. On, again, both sides of the aisle, sort of. Sorry, my cell phone is going off. I think that, you know, I just don't think that I don't think it's appropriate when groups that do not represent a majority of Americans' views say that they do and use the media to sort of amplify what's not there. So that's my only thing. It's kind of a wishy-washy answer. I mean, I don't think it's fair. I mean, I don't think it's fair for groups that just don't happen to know how to use Twitter or any of these more newfangled social media tools that I certainly don't know how to use. That because they know how to do that, they can take over the airwaves for weeks when really we should be focusing on things that are impacting us day in day out, not just us, a handful of people, but us, the American public. And so I think it's okay everything in moderation. I'll put it that way.
Okay, and just from your own personal experience, from the time that you were up there on the Hill to now, how do you see policy making changing, or what have you heard about the differences
Uh,
between now and
oh man, it is so brutal right now. It's just my husband works for a senator, and so I mean I am still seeing what's happening through him, and just and having just living in D.C. You have half my friends work on the Hill. Was the middle of the road, and he would reach across the aisle all the time. It didn't matter this was a Republican thing or a Democratic thing. It's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do for the country, and let's do it. I don't care if you have an R or a D next to your name. Let's just do the right thing. Now, I mean that's just not happening. So it's sad, and I mean you can see it. You can see it. There's gridlock. It's real. People just will not put that aside. And how do we fix that? Maybe it is those smoke-filled backroomed conversations. Maybe we need more of those just to start. I've talked to a lot of my friends sort of on both sides of the aisle, and there's a hunger for it. There's a hunger for people just saying, look, let's just put aside our party alliances and let's work together. Let's work on making this country better in so many different ways. I think people want it. It's just hard to do, and you kind of get wrapped up in this, mired in this crazy media vortex and things like that. So yeah, maybe going back to whoever's suggestion that was. Maybe that's something we need. We need more smoke-filled back rooms here in DC.
And just kind of as a springboard to your closing comments, a lot of the customers that come to us in the Cultural Knowledge Consortium are talking specifically about sociocultural issues and trying to get them into the public discussion and show the weight of those kind of things on policy. What do you see as some of the key skills that people would need to be able to help that conversation start taking place a little with more frequency?
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, I think, well, there are a lot of, so it's funny, this course that I teach at GW is actually a skills course, so it's not you don't get to hear me lecture for 45 minutes ago. It's combined with what are the skills that are needed to influence exactly the question you asked. And so it's kind of a dual-headed thing. We kind of learn about the policy and the politics, and then we learn how to actually influence it. So the things that I teach that I think and have helped me professionally is certainly concise, effective writing. I mean, one-page memo. I teach how to write a one-page memo. That's the most important thing because people don't have time. There's the news media. Again, you're on your BlackBerry. Someone's yelling at you. There's a senator wanting to do whatever. You have 30 seconds. You have 1 minute to read something and make a decision. As sad as that is, but it's true. So concise, effective writing. That's really hard to do. A lot of people don't do it. And good writing. Nowadays, people don't write anymore because they're writing in text message, and that's not real writing. The second thing is public speaking. just being able to communicate your thoughts and ideas, build the relationship sort of with the public, and when you're giving presentations, I think that's important, and is really one of the top skills that you can have. And then finally, it's really just strategic thinking, and the way I teach this is through doing strategic planning from an NGO perspective, but really just thinking, 30,000 feet, 10,000 feet, 5,000 feet, 5 feet, sort of how do we get this done? Blue skies to really like how do we get this done? Where does the rubber hit the road? And I think that's really important. People often, again, maybe it's just the culture, it's the media, it's the technology, you're always sort of running around. Just doing that is really, really important, I think, is a top skill that's also, again, oftentimes missing. So I'd wrap up and just say that if you got anything out of this, it's how to make the sausage. It's complicated, it's messy. You don't know what'll turn out, but in the end, it's probably pretty delicious, and you probably want to eat that sausage. I mean, I know I do. So I think just keeping in mind that with every push there's a pull, and with every tension there's a counter tension, and it's nuanced, but there are ways to influence and take advantage of the opportunities and sort of push back the challenges from any of the sectors that we talked about, the executive branch, Congress, and NGOs. So thank you for being here, and if there are any comments or remaining questions, I'm sure Jay can pass those along.